What appealed to me was that George Lucas, who wrote it and also directed it, didn't want a damsel in distress, didn't want your stereotypical princess, sort of a victim.
She was barely over 5 feet tall, 19 years old, and she was definitely not the traditional heroine anyone was braced for. For anyone who grew up in the 70s and 80s, that first glimpse of Princess Leia landed like nothing else on screen. She shocked us all, and it wouldn't be the last time. Her name, as far as most of the planet was concerned from that moment on, was Princess Leia. But that's not actually where this story starts. It's not even close. Because if you only know Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, you know maybe a third of her. The rest of it, the writing, the wit, the honesty that made people trust her in a way they trusted almost no one else in Hollywood, that's the part worth talking about. Let's fade to black. She was born into the closest thing America had to royalty. Her mother was Debbie Reynolds, one of MGM's biggest stars. Her father was Eddie Fisher, a crooner so popular he was practically a boy band on his own. Carrie's early childhood played out in movie magazines before she'd said a full sentence. Then it all became tabloid fodder. Eddie left Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor, Taylor being, at the time, Reynolds' own close friend, freshly widowed. It was the celebrity scandal of its era, and Carrie grew up inside the wreckage of it, a child whose parents' divorce played out in headlines instead of at the kitchen table. Fame for Carrie was never something she chose. It was the water she was born swimming in, and she spent a fair amount of her life figuring out how to breathe in it anyway. She found her own footing on stage, not screen, Broadway, touring productions, learning the craft on her own terms before Hollywood came looking. Her film debut came in 1975's Shampoo, a small role that nonetheless put her in a Warren Beatty ensemble and on the industry's radar. 2 years later, George Lucas needed someone to play a princess who could hold a blaster like she meant it. Fisher auditioned, got the part, and at 19 became the face of the biggest film in the world. This is where we'd usually pause for the numbers, the record-breaking opening, the merchandise, the overnight fame most actors chase for a career and never catch. Here, it was virtually instant. And this is where I'd usually ask you to hit subscribe while things are still calm. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by Christmas, and honestly, at this point, I might need the force to get there. So, if you're enjoying this, the button's right there. Right, back to the story. Leia herself was something new. She wasn't rescued so much as she rescued everyone else and made it look like an inconvenience. Fisher played her with a dry, unimpressed wit that cut clean through the space opera around her, and audiences noticed. She wasn't a passenger in her own story, which left her with a genuinely strange problem. How do you build a life and a career when the entire planet has already decided who you are? Fisher spent the next 2 decades quietly proving the planet wrong. She returned as Leia across the original trilogy, of course, but also built a filmography that had almost nothing to do with the Force. In 1980's The Blues Brothers, she turned up as the mystery woman with a rocket launcher, playing menace entirely for laughs. 6 years later, in Woody Allen's Hannah and Her Sisters, she held her own in a cast stacked with heavyweights, proving there was real dramatic range under the comic timing. 1989 gave audiences 2 very different sides of her in the same year. The exasperated voice of reason opposite Tom Hanks in the suburban satire The Burbs, and the best friend with the best lines in When Harry Met Sally, the kind of supporting role people remember better than half the leads in other films. 2 years later came the deeply odd, oddly beloved Drop Dead Fred, which has spent decades quietly gathering a cult following of its own. She didn't need to be the star to be the reason you remembered the scene. That became something of a signature. That same year, 1991, marked the start of her second career almost nobody saw coming. Fisher became one of Hollywood's most trusted script doctors. The writer-directors called when a script had good bone structure but dead dialogue. Over the next decade and a half, her uncredited touch reportedly shaped scripts for films including Hook, Sister Act, Lethal Weapon 3, and The Wedding Singer. Though, fittingly for someone so allergic to self-promotion, she rarely took credit for any of it. In 1997, she played a memorably deadpan therapist in the first Austin Powers film, and cameos in Scream 3 and Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back became the kind of surprise appearances fans still bring up on forums decades later, proof that even a few minutes of Carrie Fisher on screen tended to outlast films built around people with far more screen time. Colleagues described someone who was, off-camera, often the funniest person on set, faster with a line than the script supervisor could write it down. That reputation followed her everywhere, and it's a large part of why the script doctoring career took off the way it did. But away from all of it, the sets, the scripts, the sharp one-liners, she was fighting something considerably harder to laugh off. This is the part of Carrie Fisher's story that made her matter to people who'd never seen a single Star Wars film. By her own account, her drug use started as a teenager, and it followed her onto the biggest sets of her career. She's spoken about using cocaine during The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, and relying on sleeping pills 3 years later on Return of the Jedi. That same year, 1983, she married the singer-songwriter Paul Simon, whom she'd first met on the Star Wars set back in 1977. It was a tempestuous, on-again, off-again romance long before it was a marriage, and the wedding didn't change that. They divorced just 11 months later. True to form, they kept finding their way back to each other on and off for another decade afterward. In 1985, after months of heavy use, she overdosed on a combination of prescription medication and sleeping pills and was rushed to hospital, the event that would eventually reshape her entire career. Rather than hide from any of it, she turned it into material. Postcards from the Edge, published in 1987, was a semi-autobiographical novel about a young actress cycling through addiction and a famous, complicated mother. The parallels to her own life impossible to miss. 3 years later, she adapted it herself into a film starring Meryl Streep. It wasn't a confession dressed up as fiction. It was Fisher doing what she always did best, finding the joke buried inside the pain, without ever pretending the pain wasn't real. She was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and talked about both conditions with a candor that was, for the time, close to unheard of. She even gave her mood swings nicknames: Roy for the mania, Pam for the crash that followed, because, she said, it made them easier to live with. She discussed it all openly on television and in interviews, and eventually turned the story into her 2008 memoir and one-woman stage show, Wishful Drinking. Through live shows and public speaking that mixed genuine comedy with genuine advocacy for mental health awareness, for addiction recovery, for anyone who'd been told their diagnosis was something to hide, she became, without really trying to, a kind of permission slip for other people to talk about their own struggles out loud. What I really deeply admire about Fisher is that none of this was packaged as tragedy or self-pity. Her approach was resilience with a punchline attached, proof that you could be genuinely funny and genuinely honest about genuinely hard things in the very same sentence. In 2015, Fisher put the gold bikini and the blaster aside and returned as General Leia Organa in The Force Awakens, introducing her to an entirely new generation of fans who'd grown up on nothing but the prequels and second-hand nostalgia. It shouldn't have worked as well as it did. It worked anyway because Fisher brought the same unimpressed authority to Leia at 59 that she'd brought at 19. Off-screen, the friendships were just as enduring. Her bond with Mark Hamill outlasted the franchise itself, built on decades of inside jokes and mutual exasperation with the fame that had swallowed them both in their late teens and early 20s. Her relationship with Harrison Ford, reportedly complicated, reportedly real, the subject of her own later candor, was one more example of Fisher refusing to varnish her own history for anyone else's comfort. George Lucas spoke for years afterward about how completely she'd made Leia her own, far beyond anything written on the page. Then, in December 2016, Carrie Fisher died suddenly, not long after a medical emergency on a flight home. She was 60 years old. Tributes poured in immediately from Hamill, from Ford, from collaborators across 5 decades, all circling the same idea. Hollywood had lost someone who never once pretended to be anything other than exactly who she was. The next day, her mother, Debbie Reynolds, passed away as well. Two icons, one family, 24 hours apart. A loss so strange and so total that it briefly stopped the entire industry in its tracks. A year later, The Last Jedi arrived in cinemas, dedicated to her memory. The film became one of the most divisive in the franchise's history. Critics were positive, but audiences split hard, arguing over it for years. Fisher's performance was never part of that argument. Critics and fans who agreed on almost nothing else agreed on that. Her final turn as General Leia was quietly one of the most moving things in it. A farewell that landed as pure nostalgia, no matter which side of the debate you were on. What's remained since is a legacy built on something rarer than stardom. Carrie Fisher was loved not because she seemed perfect, but because she never once pretended to be. She turned a role that could have swallowed her whole into the opening chapter of a much bigger story, one written, edited, and delivered entirely on her own terms. Princess Leia introduced the world to Carrie Fisher. It was everything that came after: the wit, the writing, the honesty, the refusal to hide a single hard thing about herself that made the world fall in love with her. This is, if I'm honest, why I keep coming back to people like her on this channel. She swore constantly and unapologetically, in a way most industry publicists would have spent years trying to sand down, and instead, directors and colleagues simply learned to work around it because it was exactly who she was. In 60 years, turbulence and all, Carrie Fisher never once bent herself into someone else's idea of who she should be, and she did it without ever making that anyone else's problem. That's rarer than it should be, and it's a large part of why so many people in this industry adored her. There won't be another one quite like her, and I don't think there's a better lesson in this business than that one. I really hope you enjoyed this, and as ever, I really do look forward to seeing you all in the next one.